I've been going through the Acts of Pilate, also known as the Gospel of Nicodemus. There are two forms of this and two parts of each form. For this video, I'll only address part 1, and for the most part, I'm going to be speaking mostly about form 1, because that probably is the earlier version. Now, Justin Martyr mentions a book called the Acts of Pontius Pilate, and we're not 100% certain that this book is the same as the Acts of Pilate, though it certainly appears very consistent with whatever text Justin Martyr has. There is nothing in Justin Martyr's mention that would exclude this text, and this text presents some really cool things. Once again, just like the Gospel of Peter, the Acts of Pilate says too much. In chapter 11, the Acts of Pilate specifically says that the death of Jesus was accompanied by an eclipse of the sun. We're not talking about a vague sense of darkness that is shown in the synoptics. Oddly, the Jews say it's an ordinary eclipse. Pilate thinks it's something more important, and this is where you get the allegory of the sky commotion, the sky shaking, or the starquake. Pilate's idea that this was a commotion that resulted in darkening is what gets transferred into the earliest accounts. The Jews are actually telling the truth here, but Pilate's understanding is the one that makes it into the rest of the Gospels under the allegorical title of Seismos. One other curious thing pops up here. This is actually going to deal with both forms of the text. Form 1 in chapter 13 says there was a seismos, a commotion that accompanied an angel coming down from heaven and moving the rock. Even though it has been translated as earthquake, in no way does the author indicate that this was an earthquake. Form 2 specifically says there's an earthquake, rocks are breaking apart, and the entire planet Earth is shaken by this event. I had suspected that I may very well see this drift from a sky commotion allegory to an earthquake, and here it is. Originally, this is simply a commotion in the sky, and eventually it turns into the most terrible earthquake you can possibly imagine. The later authors simply lost the original meaning. Now, back in the Synoptic Gospels, there is only one Gospel that mentions this event as specifically an earthquake, and that is Matthew. Matthew's resurrection account is very similar to the second form of the Acts of Pilate. There is a strong likelihood that Matthew actually derived his resurrection account from the Acts of Pilate, and since Justin Martyr seems to be quite familiar with an Acts of Pontius Pilate to the point of calling it by name, while in no other way naming any of the canonized Gospels, the most likely conclusion is that at least one of these forms predates Justin Martyr and Matthew, and very likely both forms come before Matthew. There is apparently a movement from an allegorical eclipse understanding to an understanding of an earthquake. It's a linguistics issue, but by masking the events in the sky under the title of Seismos, they lost the idea rather quickly. There are some other real oddities here, and I'm going to mention some of them. First, a major character of this story is Nicodemus. In the canonized Gospels, this story only shows up in John, but in this book, Nicodemus, Pilate, Joseph of Arimathea, and a whole bunch of Jewish priests are the main characters. Now, out of all of these people, it does not appear that there is one apostle mentioned. There is a person named Judas, but he's a Jewish priest and doesn't appear to be the apostle. Here's another oddity. In the Acts of Pilate, when Jesus is coming into town on a donkey, the Roman imperial standards bowed down to him on their own. Talk about some weird stuff. And finally, just like the Gospel of Peter, we have this strange story of Jews literally being distressed and beating their chests with sorrow over the event. Now, in Peter, they directly relate this to the destruction of Jerusalem. In Pilate, the story is in allegorical form. This story is actually closer to Marcion, but it should be noted that otherwise this text shows strong similarities to Matthew, but only minor similarities to Marcion, and that largely this text shows the same exclusivity that John does. It simply does not follow that the author borrowed from any of the synoptics. So I think we have a priority text over Matthew, and though it's not necessarily required, it probably predates Marcion as well. Marcion seems to be a new type of tradition, where stories are coming together and a summarized gospel is being put forth. Pilate gives Matthew his resurrection story, and that's great. I don't really have a date for it, and unfortunately, due to the lack of sources, I may never find one. Peter is still floating around out here, and he may not come into the picture until I get other texts eliminated. John has the potential to move backwards in time, but for now, this is what I have, and we'll see where it goes from here.